Hey y'all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a revisited look back at the Red Hydrogen 1 here in 2024. I think this is one of the more commercially disastrous launches in terms of the smartphone space in recent memory, in part because it was Red's first foray into making a smartphone, a company that is much more well known in creating professional videography cameras that is used by Hollywood film productions. So it's a pro camera brand, and what folks expected was their smartphone to similarly have excellent photography and video capabilities. But unfortunately, that really wasn't the case with the Red Hydrogen 1. In fact, it was a very average 12 megapixel sensor made by Sony, and even the software processing wasn't done by them in-house. They actually outsourced it to another company called Leia, which we'll talk about more later on in this video. The phone also was postponed by quite a while due to supposed inventory and production issues, and by the time it came out, it was using components that was already dated in the smartphone space by about a year, as well as having a design that definitely did not look quite as sleek and stylish as many of its contemporaries, such as the Samsung Galaxy S8 actually came out in the exact same year, among the first slew of smartphones to adopt a taller 2:1 aspect ratio screen that is now the norm these days, with a larger screen-to-body ratio. In comparison, the Red Hydrogen 1 had a pretty chunky looking bezel and a much more conventional 16:9 aspect ratio screen of yesteryear. So it was a bit of a kind of oddball when it came to design, though one can argue that it's the opposite of a super sleek phone. They're trying to go with this whole industrial look with these extra thick grips, making it really comfortable to actually hold, surprisingly, straddling the boundaries of more of a rugged phone design more than anything else, and at least gave it some personality, I would say. Unfortunately, though, the phone was also extremely expensive. There was a titanium version of the phone, which also retailed north of $1,000, and so this was a device that competed directly with the kind of iPhones as well as the Samsung Galaxy S phones of the world, the Ultra devices, but the overall software polish, again, just didn't necessarily justify that really high price point. And so after just a couple of months, the Red Hydrogen 1 was pulled from shelves, and the CEO later departed from the company and went into retirement as well. So I think it's still interesting to look back at this phone, though, and see, what are some of the aspects that perhaps it did well ahead of its time, and what are some of the areas that led to it being a bit of a tech flop, and exploring it a little bit further. So anyways, this phone has a 5.7-inch display here on the front. It is a Quad HD 2K resolution panel, so sharpness at the very least is pretty decent, protected by Corning Gorilla Glass, and since it came out in 2018, it is running on Android 8.1 Oreo, but because the phone was essentially killed just a few months out, there were 0 OS upgrades pushed out to this phone by Red, which is kind of funny for a phone that is, again, north of $1,000 and having essentially 0 software support. Anyways, it does have stereo speakers, though, on the very front, including the bottom here on the very top, so it produces a little bit more stereo separation as you're listening to audio, and you see a wide cluster of cameras up top, which is used to capture 3D photos. And that was actually the main selling point of the Red Hydrogen 1. They used something called a 4-view display from Leia, and it's a kind of glasses-free 3D display tech that can draw parallels to the Nintendo 3DS, as well as preceding 3D phones, including the HTC Evo 3D that came out almost a decade prior. So it's not like this technology was completely new, but 3D as a trend, unfortunately, just never really took off. But the whole spiel from Red's part was that the 3D technology should be more impressive, and that's partly explained in the name 4-view, which represents that there are 4 different angles or perspectives that you're able to still see the 3D content in, compared to conventional 3D displays of yesteryear could only be seen from one specific angle, and if you slightly looked off axes, the illusion would get broken and you're left with kind of a headache, resulting in a slightly smoother experience as you're tilting and holding onto the phone from different angles. That being said, one issue with adding more planes of view into this 3D effect is every single time you're introducing these new views, you're essentially splitting the resolution of the display down, and you are left with a overall picture quality that seems quite pixelated. And thus, what Red tried to market as a quote-unquote 3D holographic display turned out to be quite a polarizing function that folks maybe used once or twice if they're capturing photos, for example, using these 12-megapixel cameras, which are, by the way, exactly the same. They don't have really any telephoto or ultra-wide-angle capability. It's just you need 2 identical camera lenses to capture photos in 3D that you can then view back. was seen as a bit of a gimmick by the general population, especially for such a camera-centric brand. To Red's credit, though, they did design some Pogo contacts on the back of the phone, which was supposedly around the idea of modularity, and they promised in the future you could snap on more advanced camera modules to improve on the photography and video capabilities of the phone, but ultimately with the project canceled, we never really got to see that. I think what people were really expecting, though, was a similar premise as Motorola and their Moto mods, was something like the Hasselblad True Zoom mod that could again snap onto those pins and essentially gave you a slightly better zoom or overall sensor as compared to the regular one found on your phone. The construction quality, though, is definitely top-notch. Aside from the use of metal alloys on all the rails and the back, you also have some carbon fiber soft touch rubber accents running along here as well. Definitely is distinctive. Now on the right hand spine, there's access to the power key integrated with a fingerprint scanner, which is actually relatively fast and responsive. You also find a shutter key there for taking images with the camera. You can half press to focus and all the way down to snap a shot, and you can also long hold for a couple of seconds to instantly jump into the camera app, which is at least one nice touch, along with some of the kind of fun sound effects there that Red at least designed to make the phone feel and have a little bit more personality. The very bottom here does have a USB Type-C port for charging up the relatively large 4,500 milliamp hour capacity battery, which even now can still last for about a day and a half before you have to really recharge it again. And the right-hand spine featured the extremely tactile and large volume rockers, which are quite easy to press. The top here also housed a standard 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, as well as the SIM card tray. Now the phone is otherwise powered by the Qualcomm Snapdragon 835 octa-core processor, and to Qualcomm's credit, this still feels like a decent performer. This 10nm chip was definitely a bit ahead of its time compared to something like the Snapdragon 820 line, for instance. It kind of brought it into a more modern era, I would say, for mobile computing. Although it's far from being the fastest chip, especially in 2024 standards anymore, you can still use it for the basics. Navigating around doesn't feel too slow, surprisingly, and thermals have also been handled relatively well on this particular chipset. You'll also find the regular essentials on any smartphone, which are inclusive of the built-in GPS, NFC for contactless mobile payment, Bluetooth, dual-band Wi-Fi. The software experience is also relatively clean. There's not too much customization going on here, aside from a sprinkle of apps that you see here from Red and Leah, responsible for the production of the 3D display as well as all the software that uses that 3D aspect. So that includes the Leah player as well as many of the 3D demo games and apps that you can launch on the device were all developed by this company Leah. And so in retrospect, it seems like Red's presence here was not really felt, ironically enough. In fact, one can argue that it was quite a backhanded approach, because even the camera application here that is using that 3D camera built onto the actual phone itself is developed and managed by Leah. So it seems like they outsourced all of that software work, and what they really did here is just produce a shell of a phone and kind of called it a day, which is perhaps one of the reasons why it just was not bound for success. In an interesting twist of events, the company Leah is still around and trying to make 3D holographic displays work. They were actually at the recent 2024 CES event, and their company CEO actually is still using a red Hydrogen 1 phone for demonstration purposes, but now they're trying to work with other laptop manufacturers to bring this 3D display tech onto larger displays from brands like Dell, Asus, so on and so forth, which is probably a better idea since you can watch movies a little bit more comfortably without having to hold the phone. And I think that's also why Leah created their own tablet called the Loom Pad, which is powered by the exact same screen tech, as well as having many of the same applications, including what they call the Leah Store, which is their own version of an app store that you can download more 3D content for the device, using that quote-unquote proprietary Lightfield 3D hologram technology by incorporating additional layers behind the IPS LCD display that can be triggered on or off, and as a result you're able to switch between regular 2D view, which is very sharp, or that 3D view that kind of pops out a little bit, but you have a much lower resolution because of the multiple planes that we talked about. Now again, 3D is really the main selling point of this phone. Everything, including even the audio enhancement, is called 3D audio. Perhaps it didn't help that this phone was also a carrier exclusive to Verizon here in the United States, as opposed to being sold unlocked or on a GSM carrier, so availability was also a little bit on the limited side from the release. However, recently, users have reported that the Leia App Store seemingly no longer works on the Red Hydrogen 1, and the company came out with an announcement that unfortunately, there have been breaking changes on the software side of their App Store and hardware compatibility with their newer products, making it no longer backwards compatible with this first generation Red Hydrogen 1. So their Leia Store app basically no longer works, but they have provided a repository on their website where you're able to still download all of the 3D applications if you don't already have them on your phone as APKs, and then you can sideload them onto the phone just by kind of manually dragging the files over or downloading them in the browser instead. So a little bit unfortunate, but you can still experience some of those 3D content, though some of the perhaps newest applications in the Leia store going forwards will no longer be compatible with the Red Hydrogen 1. Anyways, taking a closer look at the camera app next, you can tell that it's quite bare bones, but at the very least you can turn on and off HDR, and we do have the ability to also toggle onto kind of a more manual mode for changing adjustments like ISO, exposure settings. Some other features that you have here include color adjustment as well as a histogram view. There is also a beauty mode available on here as well, and that is essentially the app as well as a kind of bokeh effect that you can play around with. On video, you can similarly adjust the color, including the Kelvin, saturation, contrast. And so to Red and Leia's credit, it's not a shabby experience per se. It definitely is far from the worst camera experience on a smartphone. In fact, I would say it's average, if not slightly above average for a phone from 2018 when it comes to sharpness. Pretty responsive to shoot with as well. Colors look natural enough. It's just not quite to the same level as, say, an iPhone or a Pixel from the same generation that maybe people were expecting. But you do have to be in good lighting conditions because there are no kind of night mode, there's no additional computational photography on top of the Pro mode manual controls. And speaking of 3D, you're able to view back your images on the proprietary application called the Leia Viewer app. So this is basically their gallery app that allows you to take a look at what you have captured. And as we are tilting the phone here side by side, it kind of captures a representation of what we see in front of us. So that is where the 4-view magic comes into play compared to conventional 3D screens of yesteryear that only worked in this landscape mode and at one particular angle. You're able to now glance around and see a little bit more perspectives into this particular image. The problem though is, again, it's not the sharpest thing in the world, especially if we try to zoom in a little bit more. You definitely notice much more pixelation since, again, all the images here are basically reduced by 8. That being said, you definitely get that 3D effect, especially if you capture something with multiple layers, getting closer to the camera and something further away, even if it is a little bit of a gimmick as opposed to being kind of a killer feature just because the content available in 3D isn't massive. That being said, on many of Leia's newer products, including the Loom Pad, has supposedly upscaling to 3D automatically that's being done server-side if you're watching regular YouTube, for instance. So it has a little bit more versatility there where regular content can turn into 3D, but unfortunately that's not really the case on the Red Hydrogen 1, where it doesn't really have support for that particular capability. But overall, this serves as an example of what you can kind of expect with this type of display in general. I would say aside from the slightly better viewing angles, the resulting effect is a little bit more impressive compared to the HTC Evo 3D from all those years ago, but the overall impact, I suppose, is not too terribly different. So there are certainly moments here where you can partially see the magic and kind of understand what Red were going for. But unfortunately, this type of technology really is dependent on the availability of apps and content, as well as whether it feels comfortable for long-term usage. For example, here's a demo game that is supposedly in a dungeon, almost like the light beams are hitting your own face and coming out of the screen. So this is one of the better demos of what this technology is capable of doing, and just adding a little bit more to the immersiveness of this phone as a whole, I would say. But unfortunately, again, these moments are kind of far and few between. But ultimately, I think it's a strange decision on Red's part because they're gambling with a brand new technology and they're almost trying to make an app ecosystem work from the ground up, which is really not their forte. Here's yet another example of a animated, maybe picture book that goes frame by frame into different elements you're able to interact with. Here's also one of the other few 3D games that you're able to access and download from the Leia repository, which is a tower defense game that you're able to see kind of in 3D. The buildings here almost pop out in front of us. And some of the final apps here include Leia Frame, basically turns your phone into that holographic 3D picture frame that goes through a slideshow if you set the phone down onto a table or kickstand. Leah Pix is also kind of a social media app where other folks that have taken some of their holographic images can share them. Here's also a quick demo of the built-in speakers and what watching a video is like on this phone. So overall, again, the audio is not bad, and to Red's credit, they didn't really skimp on the components, at least. For areas including the haptic vibration motor, all feels pretty precise using the standard Gboard as you're typing things on, and overall, the phone for the most part feels a little bit more responsive than I was expecting. Again, the Snapdragon 835 is actually very ahead of its time when it comes to compute power, so even now in 2024, if you're just watching back some quick clips or browsing the web, but still is doing a respectable job when it comes to responsiveness, not really hanging up, and pinch to zoom still feels actually quite zippy as well. The phone, by the way, does come with 6 gigabytes of RAM inside, which is kind of an interesting number as well, but it helps you do a little bit more multitasking, and I suppose it was also designed with the intent to run some of those 3D holographic apps that might be a little bit more resource intensive. Now, you're also able to take a quick look at some wallpapers that were designed from Red. It all looks reasonably attractive and shows off some of the vibrancy of the panel, which again, in the normal mode with the 2K res, actually does look relatively sharp. And this is also where you're able to adjust some of the properties, like if you want the icons to be displayed as squared or slightly rounded off. Alternatively, even the transition effects going between the different pages can be played around with. In fact, there's quite a few additional options that you can use to customize a home screen. Under, for instance, gesture, if you are clicking on swipe down, you're able to expand notifications, screen lock, assistant, so on and so forth. Similarly, swiping down with 2 fingers, you can use to capture a screenshot, for instance. Even pinch in and pinch out can be used to trigger other special commands as well. So a little bit more customization there going on. Another small detail where Red showed a bit of customization would be in the power screen. Even the icons here are in this hexagon-like shape. And so that is more or less it as far as our revisited look back at the Red Hydrogen 1. This has to be one of the most quirky smartphones released in the past few years. Although it's primarily known for being a bit of a failed experiment on Red's part, as a tech enthusiast, I still like the unique character that this phone brings. And although time has shown us again and again that 3D seems to be a kind of a gimmick that consumers aren't always jumping at, with other examples including the Amazon Fire phone, also being Amazon's first ever smartphone that was a commercial failure, losing out money, also trying to experiment with 3D, although the display was just a conventional one. It just has a few more cameras on the front for tracking your face and changing some of the dynamic wallpapers accordingly as you are looking at the phone from different angles. Not to mention the HTC Evo 3D was never a smash success to begin with, so those were some clues that perhaps Red should have picked up on to know how challenging it is really to get into the 3D space, especially with a smartphone. But nonetheless, it is one of the most recent attempts at trying their hand at something like this, and some of the applications can still be kind of fun to play with, even though support from Leah's part again is unfortunately no longer really actively available. Really, aside from this device, it would have to be the Nextbit Robin, as well as the later Razer phones, that are some of the other 16:9 aspect ratio devices, which also embraces the slightly larger bezels on the top and bottom with a little bit more style and flair, almost like a purposeful decision. And so for me at least, the aspect ratio isn't something that bothers me too much, to be honest. But for all its flaws and limitations, at least this isn't a boring phone, and I think it reminds me of the days, especially in the early 2010s, when smartphones were still fun. Every device had a unique selling point of its sleeve, as opposed to being just a uniform slab that is almost identical from one another. So there's still a part of me that wishes other phone companies would take risks like this, even if they don't always turn out for the better. But it also goes to show how difficult it is to thrive in the mobile space, with many companies coming and going, including one of the OGs like HTC, and in recent years we've seen LG, even Essential Phone, one of the other newcomers, really not coming out with a second device after that. So it's an incredibly competitive space, and on one hand, again, it's easy to point fingers, but gotta say, at least it was a memorable and unique device from Red's part that tried to do something a little bit different from the majority of other slab form factor phones on the market. In any case, there's a lot to learn from this device, and still is a pretty interesting phone, I have to say, here in 2024. You can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below. Thanks again for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a look back at the Quirky Red Hydrogen 1 here in 2024.